Something happened on March 4th, 2026 that most Americans still haven't fully processed, and I think it matters more than almost anything else being discussed right now. A United States Navy submarine, the USS Charlotte, slipped silently beneath the Indian Ocean, far from any battlefield, far from the Persian Gulf, and fired two Mark 48 torpedoes at an Iranian Navy frigate called the IRIS Dena. One of those torpedoes connected, the ship went under in 2 to 3 minutes. There were 180 people on board. According to Iranian military figures, 104 of them died. That's 104 human beings, sailors, officers, and yes, members of the Iranian Navy band, swallowed by the ocean before sunrise off the coast of Sri Lanka. And when the dust settled, the USS Charlotte simply slipped back into the deep and left. No rescue attempt, no lingering, just the cold mathematics of modern naval warfare broadcast on the Pentagon's own social media account like a trophy. And Pete Hegseth stood at the podium and said, and I'm not making this up, "Quiet death, that phrase should stop you cold, because it tells you everything about the world we are now living in and the direction this country has chosen to travel." Now let's talk about what actually happened here, because the full picture is something the mainstream conversation has consistently failed to give you. The IRIS Dena was not lurking in the Persian Gulf preparing to strike anything. She was not positioned near an American naval asset. She was not on any offensive operation. She had just spent the previous 2 weeks at Visakhapatnam, India, participating in the Milan 2026 multinational naval exercise and the International Fleet Review 2026, a gathering of warships from 74 nations, including the United States. Let that sink in for a moment. The United States also attended the same exercises and may have been aware that the ship was unarmed or lightly armed, since participation in the International Fleet Review required participating vessels not to carry any ammunition. The IRIS Dena had just finished shaking hands, so to speak, with navies from dozens of nations. Her crew had visited the Taj Mahal. They had walked through Indian cities, been welcomed at port, hosted dinners, and then they turned the ship around and started heading home. That's when the torpedo came. At 0508 local time in international waters 40 nautical miles south of Gali, Sri Lanka, a Mark 48 heavyweight torpedo struck the IRIS Dena beneath her keel. The vessel was approximately 1,700 nautical miles from Iran's nearest coastline and over 1,350 nautical miles from the nearest active theater of the war. I want you to hold that geography in your mind, because it is crucial to understanding what this event truly represents. This was not a battlefield engagement. There was no firefight. There was no exchange. There was no imminent threat to any American ship, any American sailor, or any American interest within thousands of miles. This was a nuclear-powered submarine hunting a vessel it already knew was likely unarmed, in waters belonging to no one, near a neutral country that had no idea what was about to happen on its doorstep. Now I understand the legal argument. I've read the experts. Professors of naval warfare law argue that the attack demonstrates enemy warships remain lawful military objectives in an international armed conflict irrespective of their immediate actions, and that participation in multinational exercises does not immunize a warship from attack. And technically, within the very narrow corridors of the law of naval warfare, that argument holds water. The United States and Iran are in a declared armed conflict. A warship is a warship. The law, in its most clinical reading, permits this. But let's be honest with ourselves here, because that kind of technical legality is the refuge of people who want to avoid the much harder moral and strategic conversation. The law permits many things that wisdom forbids. And what I want to talk about is not whether this was legally permissible. What I want to talk about is what it tells us about where American power is heading, what it costs the world, and whether the American people are being given the full honest picture of the consequences. The San Remo Manual on the Laws of Naval Warfare, the same framework the United States cited for 4 decades against Iranian conduct in the Persian Gulf, requires neutral state notification, precaution before attack, and verified military necessity. Sri Lanka received no warning. A neutral country, completely uninvolved in this war, had a military vessel torpedoed and sunk in waters just off its southern coast, with debris, bodies, and survivors washing toward its shores, and no one told them it was coming. Sri Lankan naval personnel had to scramble search and rescue operations not because they were prepared, but because the distress call from the dying ship reached the Maritime Rescue Coordination Center in Colombo and forced a response. The Sri Lanka Navy recovered 87 bodies of Iranian sailors, who were taken to Gale National Hospital. 32 survived. Around 60 are simply unaccounted for. lost at sea, presumably gone. And the USS Charlotte was already beneath the waves and moving on. Think about what that means from a purely human standpoint before we even get to strategy. The IRIS Dena sank within 2 to 3 minutes of being struck. That is faster than you can comprehend in normal life, faster than it takes to make a cup of coffee, faster than most meetings start. 180 people were thrown into the Indian Ocean in the dark, before sunrise, miles from shore, with no warning, no life raft deployment drill, no time to organize. Iranian officials claim the frigate was attacked without warning, and there are reports that Charlotte twice warned Dena to surrender and abandon ship, but the captain refused to give that order. Whichever version of events you choose to believe, the outcome remains the same. 104 people died, and the ship that killed them disappeared without a trace. Now let's widen the lens, because one of the things that I think gets lost in the breathless military analysis and the legal debate is the geopolitical shockwave that this single torpedo strike sent through the entire Indo-Pacific. And this is where it becomes genuinely important for every American who cares about where this country's relationships are going. India had hosted those exercises. India had posted pictures on its official Navy social media welcoming the IRIS Dena to Visakhapatnam. India had officers who shook hands with Iranian officers who then got on that ship and died. The silence of the government of Prime Minister Narendra Modi after the attack was a particular embarrassment, given that India's strategic partnership with Iran was formalized in 2003, preceding its partnership with Washington from 2004. India found itself in an impossible position. It is a strategic partner of the United States, a strategic partner of Iran, and the self-proclaimed guardian of security in the Indian Ocean region. In one torpedo strike, all three of those identities were put in direct contradiction. IRIS Dena did not sink alone. With it sank India's ambition of being a net security provider in the Indian Ocean region. That's not rhetoric. That is the considered assessment of Indian strategic analysts watching their country's carefully cultivated maritime reputation take damage it did not earn and did not deserve. India had invited 74 nations to participate in naval exercises meant to project Indian leadership and foster cooperative security. And then the United States, another participant in those same exercises, used the intelligence environment of that event, or at minimum the public knowledge of the Dena's location and itinerary, to hunt her down on the way home. Professor Brahmachaleni noted that if USS Charlotte used shared data to locate IRIS Dena, it would represent a foundational breach of the defense partnership, adding that, in one torpedo strike, American hard power has punctured India's carefully cultivated soft power. And what did the Indian government say publicly? Very little, because what can they say? The United States is the hegemon. It acts, others absorb the consequences and issue careful diplomatic statements. Former Naval Chief Admiral Arun Prakash called the sinking senseless and inflammatory. Former Foreign Secretary Kanwal Sibal said the United States had ignored India's sensitivities, pointing out that the ship was in those waters specifically because of India's invitation. These are not fringe voices in India. These are senior establishment figures saying openly that their country's sovereignty and credibility were treated as an afterthought by Washington, and the Modi government's public silence in response is itself a form of communication. It communicates that India, for all its talk of strategic autonomy, does not feel positioned to challenge American decisions in its own declared sphere of maritime influence. Then there's Australia. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese confirmed that 3 Royal Australian Navy personnel were aboard USS Charlotte when it fired, adding that no Australian personnel participated in any offensive action against Iran. But Professor Don Rothwell of the Australian National University stated plainly that Australians under the command of an American submarine captain would have had very little choice but to be involved. And there it is again, the gap between the official statement and the obvious reality. Australia, a country that has been extremely careful in recent years to manage its relationships across the Indo-Pacific, suddenly found itself with its personnel aboard a submarine that had just committed the first torpedo sinking of a surface vessel by a nuclear-powered submarine since the Falklands War. That's the company Australia is now publicly known to be keeping. Every navy in the Indo-Pacific, every country that participated in Milan 2026, has now had to reckon with a simple question. If you attend an Indian exercise and your country happens to be at war with the United States, can you safely sail home? India's International Fleet Review 2026 drew warships from 74 nations. Every one of their navies must now ask whether participation in an Indian-hosted exercise could expose them to U.S. submarine operations if their flag state happens to be at war with Washington. That precedent is not a small thing. International naval exercises are one of the foundational tools of diplomatic relationship building. They are how navies build trust, share procedures, develop interoperability, and signal peaceful intent. When you weaponize that environment, when you use the transparency of a multilateral gathering to identify and track a vessel that you then sink on its way home, you have changed the rules of global naval diplomacy in a way that will take decades to repair. Nations will think twice before sending their ships to Indian Ocean exercises. India will struggle to attract the participation that gives its maritime leadership program its credibility. The damage is structural, not just emotional. Let's talk for a moment about the Second Geneva Convention, because this is where the moral weight of this event is most concentrated and where the official American narrative has been most deliberately evasive. When the USS Charlotte fired and departed without conducting search and rescue operations, it added a second violation to the first. The Second Geneva Convention requires parties to a maritime engagement to search for and collect the wounded, sick, and shipwrecked. Now, the American legal defense is that submarines cannot safely surface to conduct rescue operations, and that the United States notified Sri Lanka of the survivors' location. The swift response of the Sri Lankan Navy, which rescued 32 sailors, suggests authorities were informed quickly of the incident. If a submarine cannot safely surface to rescue survivors, it may instead facilitate rescue by reporting their location to other vessels or authorities. That is the legal minimum. The United States met the legal minimum, but remember the context. 104 people died. 60 are still unaccounted for. The ship sank in 2 to 3 minutes, and the submarine that did it was already gone before the bodies stopped sinking. There is something important I want to say about the broader architecture of this conflict, because I think the sinking of the IRIS Dena is a window into something much larger than one torpedo strike. According to the 2026 Iran war context, the United States has sunk over 30 Iranian warships in this conflict. Trump said on 6th March that there are no time limits for how long the war will continue, and Hegseth stated that the war has only just begun. 30 warships. That number alone tells you that what is happening in the waters around Iran and beyond is not a limited surgical operation. This is a comprehensive naval campaign designed to erase Iranian maritime power, conducted simultaneously with airstrikes on Iranian territory that began on February 28, 2026. And the sinking of the Dena tells you that this campaign has no geographic boundaries. It extends to the coast of Sri Lanka. It extends to waters where neutral nations had no warning and no recourse. It extends to vessels that just attended a multinational peace exercise. There are no safe zones in this war for Iranian ships, regardless of what they are doing or where they are. The torpedo strike looks less like a battlefield imperative and more like the delivery of a strategic message, one that risks normalizing long-distance naval destruction of state vessels. It represented a deliberate, long-range projection of force into the Indian Ocean, and that message was received by Iran, obviously, but also by Russia, which watches American willingness to expand military reach, by China, which has its own interests in the Indian Ocean trade routes, by every small and mid-sized nation that has been quietly telling itself that American hegemony is at least predictable, at least rule-bound, at least constrained by the international frameworks it helped build after 1945. Those nations watched the USS Charlotte fire a torpedo in international waters near a neutral state, leave without rendering assistance, and then watched the American Secretary of Defense call it a quiet death and celebrate it at a Pentagon press conference. And every one of those nations is now updating its threat assessment of what American power looks like when it decides something needs to die. Within the first 2 weeks of the war, Iran's attacks on American military bases caused $800 million in damage, and many U.S. military bases near Iran have been rendered all but uninhabitable. So while the United States is projecting dominance across the Indian Ocean, it is also absorbing significant damage closer to the theater. This is a war with real costs on both sides, costs that are not being fully communicated to the American public, and costs that extend well beyond the immediate military balance sheet. Every alliance relationship frayed, every neutral nation spooked, every international legal norm quietly shelved. These are costs too. They do not appear in the Pentagon budget, they do not show up in the news cycle, but they compound, they accumulate. And one day, when the United States needs the cooperation of the nations it chose to embarrass or ignore, the ledger will come due. What happened to the IRIS Dena and the 104 people who died on her is a tragedy in the most precise sense of the word, not just as a human loss, which it undeniably is, but as a turning point that illuminates where the world is heading and what the rules now are, or more accurately, what the rules no longer are. This is not a rules-based order, it is a power order, unilateral, unaccountable, and now openly acknowledged as such by the people running it. The Second Geneva Convention, the San Remo Manual, the UN Charter, the diplomatic conventions that normally govern how states interact during and around conflicts, all of these applied clearly to what happened on March 4, 2026, and all of them were subordinated to the decision of one submarine commander following orders from a chain of command that felt no obligation to explain itself to the world. That is the world we are in now, and if you're an American who cares about this country's long-term standing, its alliances, its moral credibility, and the kind of international order that actually serves American interests over the long haul, you need to be paying very close attention to what the quiet death of the IRIS Dena is really telling us.